December 14th, 1972. Gene Cernan climbs the ladder, glances back at the surface one last time, and humanity walks away from the moon. For 53 years, no one returns. Then NASA unveiled Artemis, a program that has already cost $93 billion, flew a capsule whose heat shield started spalling apart on re-entry, and sent 4 astronauts around the moon in a spacecraft with a frozen toilet. This isn't the glossy highlight reel. Here's every Artemis mission, meaning what launched, what broke, and what's still supposed to happen. Let's start with the silence. Cernan's bootprint on the Apollo 17 surface was the last one any human left on the moon. Not for a decade, not for a generation, for more than half a century. When Artemis VI finally carried a crew back toward the moon, it was the first crewed lunar mission since Apollo 17 minus a 53-year gap. Think about that. The people who watched Apollo live had grandchildren by the time we tried again. So what took so long, and what exactly is Artemis? The program was formally born on paper. Space Policy Directive 1 was signed by President Trump on December 11, 2017, pointing NASA back at the moon. The name came later. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine announced Artemis on May 16, 2019. And the choice was deliberate poetry. In Greek mythology, Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo. The old program was the brother. This one is the sister. Hold on to that, because it pays off at the end. Now the hardware. The rocket is the Space Launch System, and in its Block 1 configuration it generates 39,000 kilonewtons of thrust at liftoff, maced about 8.8 million pounds of force. It does that using 4 recycled Space Shuttle RS-25 engines bolted underneath, plus 2 solid rocket boosters strapped to the sides. Impressive numbers, until you compare it to the thing it's replacing. SL's Block 1 can push 27 metric tons toward the moon. Apollo's Saturn V could push 48.6, so the backbone of America's return to the moon delivers roughly half the muscle of a rocket designed in the 1960s. Keep that in your back pocket too. And then there's the money. NASA's own Inspector General estimated the total Artemis program cost at approximately $93 billion through 2025. Per launch, a single SLS and Orion system is projected at $4.1 billion madness, and we know the breakdown. $2.001 billion for the rocket, $1.371 billion for the Orion capsule, and $658 million for the ground systems that launch it. By the time Artemis VI lifted off on April 1, 2026, NASA had already spent more than $55 billion on cells, Orion, and the ground infrastructure combined. This is one of the most expensive things humans have ever attempted. There's a diplomatic layer too. On October 13, 2020, NASA launched the Artemis Accords, a non-binding framework for peaceful, transparent civil space exploration. It started with 8 founding nations: Australia, Canada, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, the We, the UK, and the Us. That list would grow enormously, and we'll get to just how far by the end. One more thing before we launch, because it tells you how bumpy this road has been. In February 2026, NASA canceled the planned Block 1B and Block 2 upgrades to the SLS, the more powerful versions that were supposed to come later. Instead, they standardized on Block 1, the version we described, to, quote, reduce risk and maintain schedule stability. Translation: the ambitious rocket got trimmed back to the one they already had, just to keep things on track. Now, the missions. Artemis I. November 16, 2022, at 1,047:44 seconds in the morning, Eastern Time, the cells roared off Launch Complex 39B at the Kennedy Space Center. This was the maiden flight of the rocket, its very first time leaving the ground minus, and there were no humans aboard. The mission ran 25 days, 10 hours, 52 minutes, and 46 seconds. This was the shakedown cruise, the test flight to see if the whole stack would even work. But it wasn't empty. Strapped into the commander's chair sat a mannequin named Commander Munikin Campos, wearing the actual Orion crew survival system suit and fitted with 2 radiation sensors and vibration sensors to measure what a real crew would feel. And that name isn't a joke. It was chosen by a public contest that drew 300,000 votes. honoring Arturo Campos, the NASA Electrical Power Subsystem Manager whose quick thinking helped bring Apollo 13 safely home in 1970. Riding alongside him were two torso phantoms, Helga and Zohar, each packed with 5,600 sensors and 34 radiation detectors, measuring the radiation dose a human body would absorb on the trip. And Orion went far. The capsule traveled 1.3 million miles in total and reached a maximum distance of 432,210 kilometers, 268,563 miles minus from Earth, breaking the distance record for a human-rated spacecraft that Apollo 13 had held since 1970. It settled into a distant retrograde orbit around the Moon for 6 days, swinging as close as 130 kilometers above the lunar surface, and it hit 161 test objectives, 20 of which were added mid-flight because the spacecraft was performing so well they piled on extra work. It also carried 10 CubeSat's tiny satellites hitching a ride, including BioSentinel, studying how deep space radiation affects yeast, and Lunar Ice Cube, hunting for water ice on the Moon. Not all of them made it. Several CubeSats failed after deployment. On December 11, 2022, Orion splashed down west of Baja California near Guadalupe Island and was recovered by the US Portland. Success means mostly, because when engineers inspected the heat shield afterward, they found something they didn't expect. The avcoat material had eroded in an odd way. Spalling chunks caused when gas trapped inside the shield heated up and expanded during the skip-entry re-entry, where the capsule skips off the atmosphere like a stone off water. The shield held. But it didn't come home the way it was supposed to, and that finding would haunt the next mission. Artemis II. April 1, 2026, at 22:35 and 12 seconds UTC, off the same pad, LC-39B. This time, there were people aboard the first crewed lunar mission since Apollo 17 in 1972. The mission lasted 9 days, 1 hour, 32 minutes, and 15 seconds, and the crew broke barriers just by buckling in. Commander Reed Wiseman on his second spaceflight, pilot Victor Glover, also on his second flight minus, and the first person of color to fly on a lunar mission. Mission specialist Christina Koch, the first woman to fly on a lunar mission. And mission specialist Jeremy Hansen of the Canadian Space Agency, the first non-American ever to fly around the Moon. 4 firsts, 1 crew. This was not a landing. It was a loop, a free return trajectory around the Moon and back. On April 6, 2026, Orion made its closest lunar approach, 4,067 miles from the surface, and as it swung around the far side, communications went dark for 40 minutes, meaning no signal, no telemetry, just 4 humans behind the Moon, out of contact with the entire planet. On that same arc, they set a new absolute human spaceflight distance record, 252,756 miles from Earth, surpassing Apollo 13's old mark of 248,655 miles. Farther from home than any human beings had ever been. But remember the toilet. Artemis I earned that tease. The heat shield erosion from Artemis were forced engineers to fly a steeper re-entry angle to protect the crew. During the flight, urine froze inside the space toilet's vent lines, a genuine plumbing crisis in deep space, resolved by heating the lines back up, and a small helium leak turned up in the European service module, though it was judged non-critical. Real spaceflight is duct tape and workarounds, even at $4 billion a launch. On April 11, 2026, Orion splashed down in the Pacific Southwest of San Diego, recovered by the US John P. Murtha, the first time the U.S. Navy had recovered a crewed NASA capsule since the Apollo-Soyuz mission back in 1975. The crew was home, and here's where the story takes a turn nobody in 2019 would have predicted. Artemis III. This was always billed as the big one, the first crewed lunar landing, boots back on the surface, the payoff to the whole program. Except it isn't anymore. In February 2026, NASA redesignated Artemis III. Instead of a moon landing, it became a crewed low-Earth orbit risk reduction mission, the a test flight in orbit around Earth, not a trip to the surface. Target launch. Late 2027. The crew was announced on June 9, 2026. Commander Randy Bresnik, pilot Luca Parmitano of the European Space Agency, and mission specialists Frank Rubio and Andre Douglas. Why the downgrade? Because the landing architecture is staggeringly complicated. The mission profile requires 3 separate rocket launches, each placing a vehicle into roughly a 230 nautical mile orbit. Orion would dock with a Blue Origin Mark 1.5 lander for about 2 days. That one has functional life support, so the crew can actually climb in sightness, and separately with a SpaceX Starship V3 for about a day, though that docking is a test only, with the crew staying in Orion the whole time. The full mission runs about 2 weeks. It also debuts the Axiom-U spacesuit, the Axiom Extravehicular Mobility Unit, built by Axiom Space, through interface testing during the orbital demo. In other words, before anyone risks a landing, NASA wants to rehearse the docking and the suits where a rescue is easy. That caution pushed the actual landing to the next mission. Artemis II. Now targeted for early 2028, this became the program's first planned crewed lunar landing after Artemis III got redesignated. The plan: 2 of the 4 crew members descend to the lunar South Pole region, Mimesis, the ice-rich, permanently shadowed part of the moon nobody has ever walked. And there was another casualty along the way. The Lunar Gateway, the small space station that was supposed to orbit the moon as a way station, was cancelled in March 2026, which stripped Gateway delivery right out of Artemis I's job list. As for which lander actually carries the crew down, SpaceX's Starship or Blue Origin's Blue Moon Venus, that decision is tied to how the earlier flights perform, and at the time of this recording it hasn't been locked in. So the single most important question of the entire program, Venus, whose rocket puts humans back on the moon, is honestly still open. So what does all of this add up to? Start with the diplomacy. Those 8 founding nations of the Artemis Accords back in 2020? By June 25, 2026, Botswana signed as the 68th nation. 8 to 68 in under 6 years. Whatever else you think of Artemis, it has become the framework a huge chunk of the world signed on to for how we go back. Then there's the tension you felt this whole video. Every SL's and Orion launch costs $4.1 billion. The rocket delivers only about half of the Saturn V's throw weight to the moon, and NASA just canceled the upgrades that were supposed to fix that meanness. So Block 1, the half-strength backbone, is what the program is standing on. Landings have slipped, a space station got canceled, heat shields spalled, and a toilet froze. It's messy, it's expensive, and it's years behind schedule. But look at what already flew. In a single mission, Artemis VI, we put the first woman, the first person of color, and the first non-American around the moon, Venus, all at once. And remember that name. Artemis, the twin sister of Apollo. Apollo was the brother who got there first, in an age of crew cuts and slide rules. Artemis is the sister finishing the sentence half a century later, slower, costlier, and far more crowded with nations and companies and firsts. Not a highlight reel, a real, stubborn, expensive return. And the boots on the moon? Still coming. If you want to keep tracking every launch and every setback as it happens, stick with Cosmic Doodle's Venus, because this story is very far from over.